Finally, we're welcoming Stephane to the virtual stage. Stephane is the former CEO of Upwork, is a future of work visionary, and is an expert on how to successfully build flexible and distributed teams. He'll be sharing some of his personal experiences and insight with Tim in our final session.
Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this session. For those of you who've just joined and missed my earlier introduction, I'm Tim Sadler. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and I'll be your host for this session. For those of you less familiar with us, Tessian builds technology to empower people to work safely without security getting in their way. And Tessian's human layer security platform automatically protects your employees on email from risks like data exfiltration, accidental data loss, and phishing. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Stephane Kasriel. Stephane is the former CEO of Upwork and a future of work visionary. Distributed workforces is part of Upwork's DNA, which makes him an expert on the future of work and the rise of flexible remote teams. And that's exactly what I'm here to talk to him about today. And we want to make sure this session is as valuable as possible for our audience. So I want to remind you that you can submit questions for us through the Q&A widget at the side of the screen. So to kick off, Stephane, can you tell us a bit more about how distributed working was built into Upwork's DNA?
Yeah, there's an expression here. So first of all, thank you for having me, Tim. This is fantastic. But one of the expressions that people use in the Bay Area is eating your own dog food. And so Upwork is a website and a mobile app that helps people work from home and helps companies engage with people that work from home. And so we decided from day one that we couldn't convince our customers to do this if we didn't do it ourselves. And so Upwork today is about 2,000 people. There's about 300 of them who work in an office, 2 offices in the Bay Area, 1 in Chicago. But the vast majority of people are working from home. I think we have people in something like 500 different cities in the world. And some of them have been working with the company for a decade or longer. So this is not just short-term gigs for low-value work. A lot of this is core software development, legal services, financial services for the company, just people that are not physically present in the office.
500 offices, that is a huge achievement to have that kind of scale of remote workforce. What have you actually learned along the way about making remote work a success with your team?
Yeah, there's a lot of different learnings. I would say increasingly people have documented those learnings. So Upwork has an entire website and it's been updated for the pandemic. Obviously to state the obvious, there's a lot more people that are working from home right now than ever in the past, many of whom were not prepared for this and their companies were not prepared for this. So Upwork has published a pretty meaningful set of recommendations, but it's not the only company that has done it. GitLab has an amazing set of documents, Zapier, Buffer, Trello, which is part of Atlassian. And there's probably half a dozen different companies that have done remote at scale, Automatic, the people behind WordPress, the people behind Basecamp. So I would say, like, at the very highest level, I would just say treat people the way you want to be treated, right? Like, put yourself in the shoes of one of your people working from home, particularly in a time like today where this is not normal remote work. This is remote work where people may be sick, people may be scared of being sick, they may have people close to them that are sick, they may have children at home, they may have multiple people on Zoom at any point in time and not enough bandwidth to connect. And so I would say rule number 1 is empathy. You realize that this is a tough time for everybody, and leading with care and love is probably one of the best things you can do. The second one, which is probably pretty obvious, is if you manage people in different time zones, realize that they have different working hours from you. So switch from a very synchronous model where everybody's on Zoom all day long or everybody's meeting at the same time to something that's more asynchronous, where you do more writing or you do more things on Loom, which is kind of the offline version of Zoom, if you will. And I would say that the third thing is just realize that you need to communicate even more when people are distributed than when they're local. So, repeat yourself, set up meetings when meetings need to be set up, document more than you would otherwise. Don't assume that everybody knows what's in your head, because that's really not true even when they're working close to you, but it's even harder for them to get into your head if they're remote. And there's a long
Yeah.
list beyond that, but I would say those are like the high level ones.
Yeah, and I love that point about leading with empathy. I think it's so important during this time. And obviously, these are, we're seeing the kind of the key takeaways from years and years of trial and error. What have been some of the lessons learned along the way? And you've outlined some really important practices here for companies who are just getting to grips with this new normal. But it'd be really interesting to understand, what hasn't worked out in the way that you thought it might have, and what approach would you encourage companies to take so that they can have a continual cycle of learning with how they're improving their remote work initiative?
Yeah, and I think like that's the key, right? Is a continuous cycle of learning, like get feedback on what's working and not, document the best practices, share them through the organization, especially if you're a bigger company. There might be part of your organization that's doing it really well and other parts of their organization not so much. And sharing best practices is absolutely essential. Um, but I would say there's probably two things. One is uh, learn about time zones. If people are in multiple different countries, um, work-life balance matters, and expecting somebody to be always awake from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. because that's what you need, um, unless that's truly what they were signing up for initially, is probably not a good idea. So when we assemble teams within Upwork, we were always cognizant of having people on potentially two different time zones that were compatible with each other, but rarely on three. So for instance, US plus Asia plus Europe, somebody does not sleep, right? So that's one component of it. The second one, um, which actually is what companies are being forced to do right now, so that's helpful, is when you're switching from a very local model to a very distributed model, the easiest way to do it is not to hire a bunch of people from the outside that are working remotely, but instead to allow your current employees, especially the people that are the most tenured, that really know everybody, know how to get things done. When they give you feedback, you're going to listen to the feedback, let them work remotely. And by the way, that doesn't just mean working from home in San Francisco. That means if they choose to relocate to another part of the country, let them do that. In fact, encourage them to do it. We at Upwork we have a relocation package. We actually call it the delocation package, which is if you're based in San Francisco and you want to move to another part of the country, we'll actually pay for your moving expenses. And the idea there is it's hard enough if you're not a remote first company, it's hard enough for your existing employees to work remotely. It's even harder for new people to come in and work remotely. And so the challenge with a lot of companies is they try to go from one extreme, which is everybody's in the same office, to the other, where you hire a bunch of new people who know nothing about the company and don't know anybody, and have them be successful. And I think the intermediate plan is take your existing people, allow them to work from home. So check, this is happening right now. Step two is allow your existing people to relocate to another part of the country if they choose to. And then step three, start to open up hiring, probably first in places where you have local employees already, because you're going to have that, face-to-face connection from time to time, which is really helpful to build a sense of community.
And this leads me on nicely, I think, that the delocation pack, I like that terminology. And there are a lot of people who are, I think, rethinking where they have to be based in terms of their location to actually now work for the companies they do. You describe flexible working as a win-win scenario, I guess, for employees and also for the employer. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit and just share a bit more of your thinking around that with us?
Yeah, and I would say there's even a third component, which is society as a whole, right? So why is it a good thing for employers? Well, the main downside, which is the myth, is people are going to be working less. It's bad for your culture. You're going to have retention issues, all that stuff. None of which is true, right? In companies that are good at measuring worker productivity, and most of them are not, there is no data that shows that worker productivity goes down when people are working remotely. In fact, there's tons of data that shows the opposite. The idea that it's bad for retention, like employee loyalty, I can give you the example of Upwork. The people that work remotely stay at the company at least twice as long as the people that are based in San Francisco. And it's pretty obvious why. If you're based in San Francisco, you've got all the other tech companies that are trying to poach you all the time. When you live in the middle of Sacramento or Stockton or Modesto or even outside of California, there's a lot less competition for talent, right? So good for companies. Employee retention obviously cost. Like the cost of living in San Francisco is so high that you can find equally talented talent for significantly less money, elsewhere, right? So that's the company point. And I would say more than cost savings, for the most part, it's about attraction of talent and retention of the talent. On the employee side, like I think we've done many surveys over the years at Upwork, and most people would prefer to have more flexibility in their life and to be able to potentially relocate to another part of the country. The San Jose Mercury News does a study every year, and they just updated it and went up again. But last year, more than 50% of the tech employees who live in the Bay Area said that they would choose to leave the Bay Area if they could keep the same job and the same pay, right? And so there's a meaningful number of people who live in places like New York and London and San Francisco and Shanghai, not because they really enjoy the lifestyle or the cost of living, but because that's where the jobs are, right? So that's how it helps people. But secondly, it also helps people that are excluded from the current workforce to participate in the workforce. So one of the studies that Upwork does every year, called Freelancing in America, we ask freelancers, would you ever choose to work for a regular employer? And 50% of freelancers say no. And when you ask them why, usually the answers are care duties, a physical or mental disability that makes it hard for them to contribute to a regular office environment, or living in a part of the country where there's no job. So you're really allowing lots and lots of people who otherwise can't get access to great jobs like yours to have access to them. And then the third piece is society as a whole. So one thing that's pretty well documented by economists is if you have a highly paid worker move to a part of the country that is economically challenged, it creates on average an extra 4 jobs. And it's pretty obvious why, right? You put a highly paid software developer in the middle of the country, and they're going to start to consume goods and services, which further creates more jobs and restarts the new economy, as opposed to today. I mean, if you look at the situation here in San Francisco today, almost all of the people whose jobs truly require them to be in San Francisco can't afford to live anywhere nearby. And meanwhile, the people whose jobs can be done from anywhere all live in San Francisco. So it's kind of the opposite of where it needs to be. And I think this distributed work approach can really be a win-win-win for society, for the workers, and for the employers as well.
Yeah. There's some fascinating stats there as well. I'd seen a few of those recently. It does, it seems obvious when you say it that there are so many other benefits that come from this kind of setup. And I guess though, from the company's perspective, it's really important that you're empowering your workforce and your employees to be successful in this environment. And there are certain things when you're running a company that you still have to get right, whether you're a remote work environment or whether you are in physical offices around the world. Obviously, a topic very close to our heart is security, and thinking about how you keep people secure with the data they're handling, whether they're working from their home office or their front room. It'd be interesting to understand your perspective, some of the things that you've done to empower your workforce overall from a technology perspective, and then when it comes to actually security specifically, what do you think companies need to have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely several components to allowing a distributed workforce to be successful. There are human resources related matters. There are legal related matters, right? Employment is regulated in just about every country, so you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. Usually there's tax and accounting implications. If you have nexus in multiple states in the US, let alone if you have people in multiple countries and you employ them directly, this might create financial, tax, and accounting matters that you need to resolve. And then to your point, there's huge security considerations that you need to take into account. And I would say, like in the case of Upwork specifically, there's two different natures of the issue, if you will. One is bring your own device, right? Most of the people on Upwork are freelancers. We don't send them a laptop. We don't send them an iPhone. We don't control their environment. But then they get access to secure environment of the Upwork infrastructure, right? So securing a bring your own device type of environment, absolutely critical. The second one is we don't know where they are. When everybody's in the office, you know that you don't have people spying on them from the behind them on Starbucks. When they're somewhere else in the world, you can't assume that, right? So you need to design systems and policies to make sure that the intellectual property of the company and the security of the company is not compromised. So to give you one example, very early on at Upwork, we decided that anything that needs to be secure should be behind the VPN, irrespective of whether you're working from home or working from the office, right? And so we've really from day one said location should not matter. There's nothing magical about the office. We should always assume that you are in a non-trusted environment and make sure that we build systems to accommodate for that.
Yeah, and this also comes down to the point as well, I imagine, of the culture that you create as a remote work company. And we're used to building culture, or certainly as a CEO, I've been used to building culture when you have people in the office, you can get people together, you can do socials together, those kinds of things. What are some of the tips that you have for organizations who are thinking about how you actually create a really, really amazing culture as a remote company, and having to consider all of these other things like the practices and you ran through some of them, HR, legal, security?
Yeah, well, I would say other than right now where everybody's stuck at home and really can't meet face to face, in general, I think most remote first companies tend to do lots and lots of face to face meetings. At Upwork, we had a meaningful travel budget where we would do meetups. So not 2,000 people in the same place, which doesn't work for most people, but we would give agile teams a small budget every year so that they could meet up in a cool city. And every time we'd have meetings in Budapest and Madrid and Chile and where have you. And it's a great perk for people. And for a couple of weeks, they would be in an Airbnb and they'd be coding during the day and they'd be, socializing in the evenings and weekends. And people tend to really like that, right? And so face-to-face does matter. I think we're going to go from a world where we organize off-sites to a world where we organize on-sites, if you will. But this, is really true. Like there is a social connection at work that is hard to do over Zoom. And regularly you need to update it by having face-to-face meetings. Now, that's not really possible right now. But I would say the second part to your answer is culture is bigger than just free coffee in the office or ping pong table or what have you. Culture is a set of values and a shared purpose. And one thing that's amazing, people everywhere in the world, or at least everywhere in the US, is you're widening the talent pool so much that you can find people that are really passionate about what you do. Um, and so as a result, you can find people who really live the values, live the purpose of the company. They're here because they truly believe in the mission of what you're trying to do. And that to me is really what culture is about.
Yeah, it's so important. I couldn't agree more. And I think as well for many companies, it's also a good thing that they're being stretched and they're being challenged to think deeper than just some of the kind of superficial, skin deep perks maybe that otherwise would have substituted something that is altogether so much more important for companies. And I have to ask you that we've spoken a lot about remote work. This is something you've been practicing for a long time now. What is your thesis? What's your opinion on the future of work? And I guess I'm specifically interested as well. This change, I guess nobody saw coming, and this way that we've been accelerated to remote working. What do you think it means for the next 5 years in terms of companies and technology, but also outside of our sector?
I think it just accelerated the future by a decade. A sobering fact is I think the virus has done more in 3 months than I've been able to do in 10 years. But we've really gone into the future in a really big way. And I think what really matters here is to understand what's not working and fix it quickly. There are plenty of things that you can do wrong. This is the time where we can improve diversity, we can improve inclusion, and we can improve efficiency and have more efficient companies. And so I think it's really important for companies to poll their managers, to poll their employees, and to figure out, very quickly, like what are we not doing well, and to optimize for it, because that train has left the station and it's moving fast right now.
Yeah. So you think that I guess this change will show companies a way of working that means that, whether they like it or not, we're not going back to the way things were. This is something that's here to stay. And whether we go to hybrid environments or fully remote environments, we now have to adapt to this new way of working.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt that every company is going to be fully distributed anytime soon, right? I mean, there's definitely going to be a hybrid model, which is one thing that companies need to figure out is how you become inclusive of the remote workforce when there's a lot of people still in the office. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions companies had about remote work that are being disproved right now. Now, to be fair, I think there's also a concern right now that because people are working from home in conditions that are not ideal. As I said earlier, people that are sick and people that have kids that are, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think some companies might come to the wrong conclusion, which is, wow, this was a real failed experiment. We can't wait to have everybody back in the office. But the reality, though, is the workforce has moved on. So if you as an employer, you think you can go back to the old ways, you're going to lose a lot of your team members because they're not moving back. In fact, the place they're moving to might be outside of where they live right now, in a place where they can have a much better lifestyle.
Yeah, no, I agree. I completely agree. We're now going to move to some audience Q&A. So we will pause those questions there and we'll move to some questions from the audience. And the question is, regardless of what happens after COVID, should businesses adopt a remote or flexible structure, in your opinion, Stephane?
Yeah, I think people have to. Frankly, I think the workforce is going to be voting with their feet. If you don't allow people to work more flexibly post-COVID, there's a lot of employers who will, and they'll attract the best talent.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, which actually it's the overall market for employment, and flexibility, as you say, as soon as it's there with one set of employers, it's going to become something that people prioritize. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of those who submitted questions. For those who didn't manage to cover, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually to continue the conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to Stephane for sharing his time with us today. I'm sure in some form of another, remote working is here to stay. So this has been an invaluable discussion for us. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to our audience also for joining our session. I'll be handing back over to Kelly, so please stay tuned.